ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the National Press Club of Australia and today's Westpac Address. My name is Sabra Lane. I'm the club's president. I'm also the presenter of the ABC radio program AM. We have a very timely discussion today, the gender pay gap, and we have two views that we'll be hearing about today. First, from Libby Lyons, the director of the Workplace Gender Equality Agency. The agency has just presented its fifth gender equality scorecard in Australia, and there is some good news and also some disappointing news. We'll also get the picture too from the UK, from Elysia McCaffrey, the Deputy Head of the UK Government Equalities Office. They've just actually handed down their first scorecard earlier this year, so it should make for a very fascinating conversation. If you're following the conversation online today, you can use our hashtag NPC, and our Twitter handle is @PressClubAUST. First, I'd like to invite to the podium Elysia McCaffrey.
Good afternoon. Over the last 18 months, I have had the exciting privilege to lead the UK's implementation of gender pay gap regulations, which have shone a light on the differences between what we pay men and women. These regulations have started a national conversation about what is really happening in the workplace in the UK and what informs the choices that men and women have been making about their careers. While I haven't met many of you in person before, a lot of your organisations are familiar to me, which I think highlights something really important about this issue. The gender pay gap is a global phenomenon. It can be observed in most developed countries, representing unrealised potential, workplace inequality, and an injustice that is yet to be resolved. While each country will have its own quirks, when we've studied the research and broken down the evidence, we all overwhelmingly identify the same causes for our gender pay gaps. And given this, it seems logical for us as legislators to think about this as a shared issue, just as it is for you as employers to treat this as a global corporate issue. With that in mind, I'm really delighted to be able to join you in what is a real milestone in Australia's gender pay gap reporting journey. You are one of the first countries to recognise the role that government should play in pushing for progress on this agenda, and also to utilise the power of corporate reporting. As we acknowledge your fifth year on this journey, I think now is the perfect time to share what we've learned so far. Here in Australia, you've got a good record of taking action on the gender pay gap, whereas we in the UK are relative newcomers to this issue. And as many of you know, we have just completed our first year of reporting under our new regulations, which really go quite a lot further than other countries have. So we require all employers with 250 or more employees to report their gender pay gap on our portal and on their own website. The range of data that we ask for, which includes mean and median pay, the percentage of men and women at each quartile of the organisation, the bonus pay and the percentage of men and women receiving a bonus, and the fact that this is then publicly available at company level, has introduced an unparalleled level of transparency for us. So over 10,000 employers reported their data this year, and that represents all of the employers that we identified as being in scope with the regulations, and millions of employees who can now push their employer on what they're doing to improve the situation. We're extremely proud of what we've achieved so far, and a high point has been the recent announcement that Bloomberg will now be incorporating our reporting metrics into their Gender Equality Index. This international recognition of commitment to transparency takes us just another step towards clear gender equality data on a global scale. And in a climate of global conversation on wider gender issues, which is only growing in volume, it seems other countries are now waking up to the problem of the gender pay gap. And it's unsurprising then that many are looking to learn from your experience and from our experience. Currently, both Ireland and Canada are looking to implement similar regulations to the ones that we have done in the UK. And I know you're all keen now to know what the figures have told us. And unfortunately, there were no surprises for any of us who've been working on this area. And to be honest, very little to celebrate. While 57% of employers had more women than men in their lowest paid employees, less than a third had more women than men among their highest paid employees. And when it comes to the differences between industries, there were no shocks there either. Employers in the construction sector reported the worst average median gender pay gap at 25%, which was closely followed by the 22% average reported in the finance and insurance sector. These figures were obviously not new to us. The UK Office for National Statistics produces data annually on the national gender pay gap, so we are familiar with the wider picture, which is that our current gender pay gap is nationally 17.9% in the UK. However, these figures were new to employers. Only a handful had ever calculated their gender pay gap before, so for most, reporting this year was a really serious wake-up call. For many company directors who'd never even heard of the gender pay gap last year, they were now faced with the reality of it in their own organisation. And that is the real power of these figures. The fact that they have to be signed off at the highest level in the organisation and made public means that business leaders care about these numbers. And if they care, then they will take action to do something about it. Gender pay gap reporting was the most covered business story in our media in the first part of this year, and the press coverage really dug deep to expose some of the worst gaps that existed. And while this was really helpful in raising awareness of the regulations, it did mean that there was some nervousness in businesses about the potential for reputational damage, as well as the ability to create and retain staff following the potential for negative stories. And many employers did then wait until right close to the deadline before they reported to kind of hide in the crowd and avoid negative media attention. But there was real kudos for those who went early, who reported early, and made a real effort to own their gap and own their data and own their narrative, and really be clear about what actions they were going to take to close their own gaps. So one of the key things that we've learned this year is that reporting the figures is just part of the process. And reporting itself is no silver bullet. It won't close the gender pay gap overnight. And we know, as I'm sure you've realised too, that if we really want to crack this, we need to get employers to act and remove any excuse that might exist not to. So as I've said, the figures were a really great way to focus minds at the top, which we hope will inspire renewed determination. To make the most of this, though, we want employers to come up with an action plan, and we want interventions that will really make a difference and a commitment to ensuring that all action has really good impact, in the same way that you've asked employers to provide that information here in Australia. To support this action, we enlisted some help from our Behavioural Insights team in the UK. And through our innovative partnership, we've interrogated the evidence and drawn out what actually works to improve gender equality. And we've provided guidance to employers who want to take the most effective actions. So this includes things like including multiple women on shortlists. We know that if there was only one woman on a shortlist, statistically she has no chance of getting that job. Or we were also encouraging employers to use skills-based assessments rather than just relying on interviews. So going forward, we want to continue to improve this evidence base that we've got, something which on an international level we think we can all benefit from. We've invested just over £3 million into research on gender equality in the workplace over the next 2 years, with the aim of creating tools that employers can use in real work settings. And I'm excited about the possibilities opened up by using behavioural science techniques in what is a completely new space to us in the UK. So we've only just completed our first year of reporting, and we know we're going to have to keep a really close eye on the impact and making sure that we maintain momentum. However, I am optimistic. A continued spotlight from our transparency, pressure from government, and a better understanding of what will actually work in the workplace, we can strike the right balance between supporting employers while holding them to account. So as the two countries, I would say this, the two countries who are blazing the trail here, when it comes to gender pay gap reporting, I think it's really important that we share what we've learned so far with other countries, but also with each other. And that's why I'm so glad to be here today. I'm so glad to join the WGEA here to hear about your experiences. And I'm looking forward to a lively discussion. And I really hope that in 5 years' time, I will be leading a conversation in the UK with the same positivity as we have here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Elysia. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional owners, past, present and those to come, of the land on which we meet today, the Ngunnawal people. And as we share our knowledge, learnings and research, may we also pay respect to the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of country. We are passionate advocates for the need to improve workplace diversity, particularly the representation of women in the senior ranks of our companies. But mandatory reporting imposes costly, complex and prescriptive processes for no discernible benefit. It'll come as no surprise to you that they are not my words. This was the view of the Business Council of Australia and others in the early days of the Workplace Gender Equality Agency. My, how things have changed. Just a couple of years later, the BCA declared, and I quote, "It can sound like a red tape, it's actually more like a green light. Without gender reporting, not only do we risk slowing progress in improving gender equality, but we won't know whether we're making any progress at all." We are making progress. Measurement is driving change and employer action has delivered real results. Some workplaces are transforming quickly, in others it's too slow. While it is frustrating, the trends borne out from our 5 years of data and the conversations that I'm having with employers make me very optimistic. And at the heart of what we do is an elementary and oft-quoted concept. What gets measured gets managed. In order to measure what we do, we need a robust reporting system. And I'd therefore like to thank the Minister for Women, Kelly O'Dwyer, for her advocacy and for announcing just yesterday the funding for a new reporting system for the agency that will simplify the reporting process for employers and expand our data set. Quite apart from the fundamental principle that we all have the right to be treated fairly and equally, equality in the workplace makes good business sense. We know this from the data that we collect, the data and research of others, and from our work with employers. Inclusive and gender-balanced teams perform better. They are more productive, and from BHP's experience, safer. It is good for the employer, it is good for the employee, the shareholder, the community, and the country. The business case is clear. And yet women are still undervalued right across Australia in the workforce. There are pay gaps favouring men in every industry and manager category and every occupation. Whether you are a nurse, a butcher or a lawyer, the gender pay gap exists regardless of the choices you make as a woman. Even if you're a woman working in the female-dominated sector, the gender pay gap still favours your male colleagues. And this isn't right. In our 5 years of collecting data and reporting data from all private sector employers with more than 100 employees, this year is our biggest data set yet. It covers over 4 million working Australians and more than 40% of our workforce. We are seeing improvements. More employers are actually taking action on gender equality, and it's happening at many levels. Significantly, more employers are analysing their data for gender pay gaps. Just over 40% of all employers now conduct a gender pay gap audit. And more employers now report taking action as a result of that analysis through introducing specific pay equity objectives and specific strategies to ensure women and men are equally valued and rewarded. The data this year shows that the gender pay gap continues to shrink. In fact, Could we have a drum roll, please? This year, it is the biggest single year drop we have seen in 5 years. It has dropped by 1.1 percentage points, and employers are to be applauded for that. Each and every year that we have collected and analysed the data, the pay gap has narrowed. But while we have the single biggest drop in a year, we still have a problem. Significant catch-up is required before women enjoy the parallel benefits to their male counterparts. Change is way too slow, and the gap is still wide and widespread. Men continue to out-earn women in total remuneration by an average of 21.3%. This means that Australian women working full-time, take home on average over $25,500 less than men. This factors in additional income such as shift allowances, bonuses, commissions and superannuation. All these things are disproportionately paid to men. This gender pay gap costs women dearly over the course of their working lives and into retirement. Women in Australia today face a serious and significant savings gap when they retire. The Australian Bureau of Statistics shows that Australian women retire with, on average, about 40% less retirement savings than men. 40%. Older women are far more likely to live in poverty and rely on the social welfare safety net. We must change this, not just for the women involved, but for our families, our communities, and our country as a whole. It is a national disgrace. Closing the pay gap is actually very easy. All that is required is for every employer in Australia to do a gender pay gap audit, identify their problem areas, develop an action plan, set targets, make people accountable, and they will be closed. They need to then keep monitoring things to make sure that those little discriminations don't creep in again. But it is that easy. The pipeline of women into management has also continued to improve this year, and this is the case across all manager categories. 39.1% of all managers are now women. And this last year, 43.3% of all manager appointments went to women. If this trend continues over the next 5 years, we will hit that magic 50-50 number in the foreseeable future. Pleasingly, there are also more women in roles of authority and responsibility. Women now hold 1 in every 3 key management personnel positions in Australia. And key management personnel is that level just below CEO. It is in fact the manager group where we have seen the greatest improvement over the 5-year period, up 4.4 percentage points from 26.11% in the 13-14 period to 30.5% in the 17-18 period. But if we are going to get more women into leadership and senior roles, and more importantly, keep them there, we need to normalise parental leave and flexible work. This is more important for men than it is for women, because women are used to working flexibly and taking parental leave is simply the norm for them. My first husband, Michael, was a criminal defence lawyer and spent many years practising law as far afield as London, Zimbabwe and Darwin, where he led a team in the North Australian Aboriginal Legal Aid Service. He was a loud and energetic champion of justice. He was also the primary carer. Actually, no, we need to move away from that term primary carer These labels, primary and secondary carers, don't help us at all. He was an active parent of our son for 2 years. It was a time he cherished. Michael went back to full-time work before his untimely death 8 years ago from a brain tumour. But thanks to that time he spent with Charlie, Charlie now has this fabulous memory of a man, a father, as a role model, as an active parent. It is a vivid and happy memory of his dad. So much so that he once told a group of friends in my presence that he was raised by his father. Apparently I had nothing to do with it. All those years ago, Michael was a rare example of a senior male lawyer having the courage and commitment to fulfil his desire to spend time on both his career and his family. Charlie is now 23 years old, and yet this story remains unusual after all these years. Children need their dads to be present in their lives. And more I am learning that dads want to be present in their children's lives. If we are to see men become more active parents, employers need to look at their parental leave policies. Unfortunately, over the 5 years we've been collecting data, access to paid parental leave has stalled. More than half of employers do not provide primary carers leave over and above the government scheme. And if a man is unable to take parental leave, there is only one choice for his partner, and that is no choice at all. Employers need to look not at the short-term cost, but at the long-term benefit. Men's working conditions matter for women. Along with parental leave, we also need to recognise that rigid workplaces where 15 and 16-hour days are the norm are not just hostile to women, but are toxic to men. As a community, we need to create a culture that facilitates balance between work, health and family. We need to erase the stigma attached to working flexibly and taking parental leave for men. The good news is that when we started collecting data, just 57.5% of employers had a policy or strategy in place to support flexible work. Over these last 5 years, that has grown to 70.7%. This is a significant improvement and a terrific outcome by employers. Because from the research, we know that the normalisation of flexible work is a key driver for gender-balanced teams. But the issue is whether these policies and strategies are being backed up by action plans for engagement. And here's the rub. Of these 70.7% of employers, a mere 5.2% of them set targets for engagement in flexible work. And a negligible 1.6% set targets for men's engagement in flexible work. With statistics like these, we know that there are still too many workplaces out there in which men are somehow considered weak or not serious about their job and career for availing themselves of flexible work or parental leave, or heaven forbid, both. Policies cannot just live on paper. They need to be implemented. And to really drive change, targets set. People need to be made more accountable. And these targets and outcomes need to be monitored. At the moment, the data clearly shows that we have an action gap. 2 out of every 5 employers know that a pay gap exists in their organisations, but have taken no steps to address it. So they know there's a problem, yet they choose to ignore it, or they believe the gap is justified in some way, shape or form. This is why this year the agency will be contacting each and every one of these 800 businesses to better understand why this is happening and to give them support, information and tools that they may need to take action. And we'll be following them up. We know that for every 4 out of 5 organisations, the gender gap metrics are not being reported to their board or governing body. This is a fundamental problem. Why is it that so many boards still do not think that measuring and tracking change on achieving gender equality is important? I don't get it. Australia's approach in measuring workplace gender equality is world-leading and one other countries are now replicating. And it was great to hear from you, Elysia, about the UK's experience, and it's been great to learn more from Elysia about what's happening in the UK. We look forward to working with your office, and we will watch with interest the outcomes of your work on the gender pay gap over time. What we know from both Australia and the UK experiences is that collecting data matters. We all have the power to influence, the power to stand up and address gender equality in the workplace. For all of the employers who report to us, ensure your organisation is analysing and acting on the gender pay gap. Set targets for women or men in non-traditional roles, and set targets for the engagement of men in flexible work. Take part in a program to improve gender equality in your industry. This year marks the 75th anniversary of the election of the first woman to the Australian House of Representatives. That woman, Dame Enid Lyons, was my grandmother. In December 1949, Robert Menzies appointed her to Cabinet, but he didn't give her a ministerial portfolio. She was rightly frustrated at the token effort, saying, "They only want me to pour tea." She was so much more than a tea pourer, I can assure you. You don't need to read the tea leaves to know that gender equality is in everyone's interests. Your interests, my interests, and in Australia's interests. Thank you.
Elysia, I'm going to be a little bit provocative here. I know that there are younger women who are impatient for change. They're expecting things to have changed before, they reached it to the workforce. At what point do women start exercising their power in many homes? They are in charge of budgets, that they use the power of the purse to start avoiding companies that aren't doing anything quickly enough in this area. And Libby, I reckon if you came here with a large scroll of companies and named and shamed them, that they'd be doing something very quickly about their gender pay gap imbalance. At what point do we say, it's nice to hear that we're making some achievement? At what point do we say, right, it is time to name and shame to get progress?
So at present in the UK, if we carry on at our current trajectory with a reasonably fair wind, we'll close our gender pay gap in 2052. I can't wait that long, and a lot of women can't. And I know a lot of men and women who have been looking at the data we've produced and looking at particularly the quartile data, where they will look and say, actually, if 95% of the people in those top jobs are men, does that mean there's a cultural problem? And should that put me off from applying for a role? And I think that's been one of the quite powerful things in the way that we've created this transparency. We know that in the run-up to the deadline for our reporting, we had 1.2 million hits on our portal. One of those was me, probably a couple, and one was Libby. So take those away. This was a level of public interest that we hadn't quite anticipated, and it was really helped by the press. But what this shows is a lot of people were going onto the portal and searching for specific employers. And anecdotally, we're told that that's with a view to them looking at, what's happening within my own organisation, but also what's happening in others and where might I be interested or where might I not be interested.
So the power of the purse, should people be seriously considering avoiding companies that aren't doing anything?
So I think we would probably have a problem if people started avoiding companies, but that actually they should use the data to push for some change so that employees within those companies where there are just men at the top, they need to be really vocal about this. And really challenge, and that's one of the things that we've sought to do with the transparency, is let employees within companies look up and challenge in that way.
Name and shame, Libby?
Well, at the moment, anybody in Australia can go in and look at what's happening in any organisation that reports into us. In terms of the pay gap and transparency around the pay gap, that really is an issue for government. But it is why we work closely with the UK and why we're watching what's happening with the UK to see whether it does make a discernible difference. What I can tell you is, in collecting and analysing and reporting data for 5 years, we are seeing change, but it's not quick enough. So, as I say, pay transparency is a matter for government.
Tim Shaw.
Thank you, Sabra. Thank you both so much for your address. Can I talk corporate and can I talk small to medium enterprise? Following on from Sabra, the notion, Libby, of corporate social responsibility, we're great, we're clean and green, or we announce to the community our brand is supporting X. And following on from that, do we need to include this equity in both UK and Australian businesses at a corporate level, saying this is what we are proactively doing? In terms of career choices in the small to medium and family enterprise space, that choice of taking flexibility rather than the salary. I'd like you both to comment on the UK and the Australian experience. More than 7 million Australians work in small to medium and family enterprise in more than 3 million businesses. They're a real engine room of the economy, Libby, and I'm just wondering if that small to medium flexibility is affecting some of the gender pay numbers that we see today.
Tim, we don't actually collect data on small to medium enterprises, so unfortunately those employees are not included in our data set. Certainly it is an area where we hope to focus some energies going forward in looking at how we can help small to medium enterprises actually put a gender equality strategy or policy in place that means something to an SME. And we are working on that, and hopefully we'll do some work with ACCI on that. But in terms of the requirement to report, certainly the ASX states that members of the ASX have to report gender equality metrics through to them, and certainly the data that we collect is publicly available to anybody who might like to see it. But I think we've got to take it one step further than that. And the fact is that the business case for gender equality is absolutely clear. Teams that are gender balanced are higher performing teams. Andrew Mackenzie, the CEO of BHP, stated that again just last week. So if gender balanced teams are higher performing teams, that's got to be a win for everybody. So, the business case is clear. There's plenty of research, plenty of evidence out there. It's just a matter of organisations taking it upon themselves and realising that in order to remain competitive, they've got to address this, and it is a serious business issue.
So on the flexible working point, I think there are a number of women who will choose flexible working arrangements over a salary, and culturally that's an accepted norm in the UK. It's probably, there's a few nods around the room, so perhaps that's a similar thing here. And we have a real problem in that if men ask for flexible working arrangements, they are considered not to be taking their career seriously, which is ironic, really, isn't it? So I think that what we really need to push for is a culture where men can ask for flexible working, that becomes a norm, that men feel they can ask for part-time hours, hours or to compress their hours or whatever is appropriate within that organisation, so that they can normalise that, so that they can be more involved in caring responsibilities as well, and create that norm. I think we introduced some new regulations recently, which mean that if you are employed with somebody for 26 weeks, you have the right to request flexible working, not the right to automatically be given, but the right to request. 26 weeks is quite a challenge, because you kind of want to know before you start a job whether you're going to get this or not. And we are now pushing for all employers to advertise all roles as flexible, except where there's a good business reason not to. And by advertising like that in the first place, we'll hopefully reset some of the culture so that men and women feel that they can ask.
John Millard.
Thank you, Sabra, and thank you both for your well-researched and quite inspired at times addresses. You've addressed, and it's a very my pleasure, of course, to meet somebody else who started their varied career in school teaching, as we both did. You've addressed the issue of pay inequality, but in many fields this has no longer been the case. For instance, the public service and teaching, we've had equal pay for 50 years perhaps, but there's still discrimination. Not just the glass ceiling, where it's difficult for women to be promoted, but it happens the other way around too, doesn't it? There are some departments in the ACT where if you've got a female manager, it's useless trying to apply for a promotion. You've addressed the major issue. Do you think this perhaps minor issue of the fact discrimination against men should be addressed as well?
Absolutely, and I think that's where that's why I talk about parental leave for men and flexibility for men. We have to normalise these things for men, because these things, normalising these things, will actually help us address the overall problem that we have. There's still a huge imbalance in Australia in the unpaid care and domestic work that women do compared to men. So for every hour of unpaid care and domestic work that men do in Australia today, women are doing an hour and 46 minutes. So we need to address that balance by allowing or giving men the permission to work flexibly. And once we address that imbalance with care and unpaid domestic work, then I think we're going to see far greater outcomes. So, you know, traditionally, women have been discriminated against in the workplace. I don't think I'd get any argument from anyone in the room about that, and if I did, well, I'd take them on. But women have traditionally been discriminated against in the workplace. But the Gender Equality Agency is there to address all of these issues. But seeing more women into management is imperative. Particularly, John, if we look at a female-dominated industry like healthcare, where 80% of all employees are women, and yet management is dominated by men. Why is that so?
Ken Randall.
Look, I'd like to ask you both whether you could dig a bit deeper into the first question that Sabra asked you. Where there are signs of progress, are you able to say what's prompted them, whether it's economic, good business sense, whether they're bowing to public opinion or just feel that it's the right thing to do? And those that aren't doing anything, what do you think is prompting them?
I think the reason that we are seeing progress is because some employers are taking action. And if we look at my former employer, and I'll go back to BHP, an employer I know very well, the reason they decided to take action was they did, as we advise companies to analyse their own data. In analysing their own data, and again we're talking a male-dominated industry here with probably only about 17% women across the board, they analysed their own data. In analysing that, they found out that the sites that had better gender balance not only hit their production targets sooner, but guess what? They were safer. And when a CEO is confronted with data and evidence like that, they have no option but to act. This has become a business issue for them. So employers like BHP have seen that they need to act because it's better for their business. It makes their business safer. Other employers have done it because it is the right thing to do. And when they've done it, they've found that there have been added benefits to addressing gender equality. Those organisations that have done nothing, I'm at a loss to understand why. Because we know that if you don't get the vision, you better get the bus, because your competitors will streak ahead of you in leaps and bounds with gender balance and gender equality as a business issue that drives them.
Can either of you talk about the companies and organisations that engage in blind recruitment, where they get applicants for jobs and information about their gender is stripped out so that they get the best person for the job? Can you tell us about that?
We do that within the UK Government Equalities Office, and it's a really great system that strips away everything. So you don't know people's names, you don't know people's education, you can't make assumptions about people's gender or ethnicity and so on. And I think it's been really helpful to us and really useful. It's also a much quicker way of sifting applications. We found the computer system that we use is. And we would think that in the Government Equalities Office we are good at this. So it's right that we've adopted this method, and we'd just like to see people doing it much more. I think it really makes a difference. I think that a lot of people, we all have unconscious bias to a degree, and one of the sort of new piece of evidence that we've been looking at is around unconscious bias training, which has become a real thing in the UK, that if you put everyone through a mandatory unconscious bias training, that improves the problem. And actually, we found that that doesn't solve the problem at all, and in some instances can make it worse, because doing an online training course has never really changed anybody's fundamental beliefs. And unfortunately, when you give someone a certificate because they've answered the questions right, it can actually reinforce some of those negative views. So we have found that the best way at the moment for us to deal with this is to strip away the opportunity for people to demonstrate those biases. Forget about mandatory unconscious bias training and just remove the opportunity to demonstrate those biases.
Libby, and Australia is a pretty blokey culture, let's face it. How do you deal with those who say, I'm sick of talking about gender, it's one of those culture wars, why do I have to do anything about this? How do you confront that kind of attitude?
Well, of course, it's disappointing, and I think that it's naive to think that we've got to avoid it, that we talk about it too much. At the heart of all of this is the need to change our culture. If we don't change the culture of presenteeism, if we don't change the culture of men being able to do a job better than women, if we don't change and challenge this culture where men fight fires and women care for children, if we don't challenge those views and those deeply held convictions almost that we have had for all these years, then, I may as well pack my bags and go home now, because we need to change. If we are to remain competitive internationally, we need to change. And look, don't misunderstand me, Sabra. Australia is leading the way in what we are doing. We really are. I have spent a lot of time travelling internationally of late, and spent a lot of time working with Chile. And Chile just last month came out and announced that they are drafting legislation, mandatory reporting legislation similar to ours. So we are doing a great job. But we have to work harder, and we have to recognise that the competitiveness of our country is dependent on embracing gender equality and ensuring that we address all these issues, particularly that one of culture, and start challenging our traditional ideas.
Kate Carnell.
Thanks very much, Sabra. Kate Carnell, the Australian Small Business and Family Enterprise Ombudsman. I'm going to follow on from Tim a little bit in the small to medium business space, because 99% of Australian businesses have less than 100 employees. It's not so different in the UK either. I think 97% of businesses over there turn over less than 2 million or less than 20 employees. It's where a lot of the growth is happening in the economy. 60% of Australians, in fact more than that now, are employed in that sector. So is it a little misleading to suggest that the figures that you've both used are about the whole economy, when you're really talking about a fairly small number of very big businesses that have traditionally had particular sorts of cultures and bureaucracy and so on, when the vast percentage of businesses that are growing and prospering in both of our countries are in the SME entrepreneurial space. And what we know is that more and more women are owning their own businesses, are running their own businesses, their family businesses, and so on. Wouldn't it be better if we actually did get some data, and I'm not talking about mandatory reporting here, but maybe voluntary reporting, on what's happening in the majority of our economies? And I suspect you'll find that what's really happening is that that sort of culture you're talking about doesn't exist in little businesses because they're really focused on growing their businesses, employing people, getting on with the job. And so to give a proper view of what Australia or the UK looks like, I think you've got to include the majority of the economy, the majority of the workforce, and one that is growing, and I think probably has a slightly different view of women in the workplace. I don't know what you think of that.
Yeah, so the figure that I use of 17.9% is our national figure, so that includes everybody. We have started looking with employers with 250 or more. Of course, you look at employers with 100, so I don't know quite how that adds up mathematically, but probably means you include more than we do. And we have committed to review our regulations in the next couple of years just to see if that's right and see if we should reduce down to 100 or reduce to a smaller number than that, so that we're really capturing greater granular data about what's happening there. But I think for us, the overall national figure really is a proxy for what's happening in workplace. You could have a very low gender pay gap because you don't employ very many women at all. You know, of course, it is just an indicator figure. But what we do know is that a lot of women leave the workforce to go and have a child or a couple of children or to care for a relative and really struggle to re-engage back in work at the right level. So we want to fix that. We want to fix the problem where women are penalised when they come to pension age and they have a much smaller pension pot than men. So there are so many component parts to this. And really we're using the gender pay gap figure as a proxy for all of the things that sit underneath that, some of which don't quite sit within that definition, I think.
On changing views about parental leave, is it perhaps time to look at what Norway has done, for example? Fathers must take 2 weeks when the child is born, and I think it's stipulated that they then have to take 14 weeks by the time the child turns 3. And that's certainly changed perceptions in Norway, I know, from first-hand experience. Is it time for other countries to look at doing something like that, to change that perception?
Well, that would be disruptive behaviour, Sabra, I think, and I'm not sure that I can advocate for that right now because I'll end up being trolled. I think that the Scandinavian countries are clearly streets ahead of us. But they've been at this for much, much longer. They've been at this since the early 70s, the late 60s, early 70s. So they are further down, that they've completed more of the journey than we have. I think that some of the larger organisations that have come out publicly recently, like Medibank, and talked openly about their men taking paid parental leave and the great success of those men who've taken paid parental leave in coming back into the workforce. I think, role modelling, getting organisations to speak openly and publicly about what's going on in their workplaces around paid parental leave is a great start. The other, I'll rest on that for a minute, I think.
Elysia, you might have a view on that.
Well, we've recently introduced in the UK that both parents can share up to 50 weeks of leave in the first year of a child's life. And take-up is quite low at the moment, and we want to see that increase significantly, and we work very closely with the Scandinavian countries to see what they're doing, to get ideas from them and to learn from them. But we have no immediate plans to go as far as Norway have.
Tim Shaw.
Thanks, Sabra. Tim Shaw, Radio 2CC here in Canberra and a member of the Press Club Board. Ladies, the challenge at the end of the day is that in Australia particularly, we never talk money, do we, Libby? No one knows what people earn. I love the experience in the UK. And on the relationship side, as the 34 years is ticking over to 2052 in the UK, what do couples, and what constitutes a couple in 2018? What do couples need to do in anticipation and preparation of everything we've spoken about today? That paid parental leave, that time with the children. Don't couples need to decide upon this before we totally engage with the employers?
Well, certainly when I speak to young people, the first thing I say is, you know, when you're getting ready to settle down, I would have a very frank discussion with your partner about what you consider your career aspirations to be and what you hope to get out of your working life. If you are both then very clear of what each wants, then you can map your path together. And I think that's very, very important. And I don't think those conversations are happening enough amongst young people. And I would certainly counsel all young people to do that, because I think it causes much friction, much angst. And it is sadly usually the woman that is losing out in these partnerships because the goals aren't shared. So certainly I would do that, and certainly, you know, continue to encourage organisations to allow men to work flexibly, to encourage men to work flexibly, to have senior men role model flexibility. All of those things are really, really vital.
Culturally, in the UK, we don't talk money either. And that's how we ended up in situations where, you know, men and women working alongside each other with no clue at all that he was being paid considerably more than the woman. You know, we had a number of high-profile stories play out in the press on this, and it is just that we've kind of culturally viewed it as a little bit crass to discuss, even between friends. So what I'm really proud of with our new gender pay gap regulations is that this is given permission for people to talk about this. Absolutely. And I think that the national conversation we've had where people have been genuinely shocked, and that shock is fabulous because that translates into action, and that translates into people challenging if they see and they find out that their colleagues are being paid more than them for doing work that's the same. And equal pay is illegal in the unequal pay, so work of equal value for men and women. It's been illegal to pay men and women differently for doing the same job for 45 years. But still, you know, issues arise where negotiations are allowed through salaries or, you know, drift through time and so on. These things happen. So culturally, it's been really great that people have permission to talk about that now. In terms of decisions around parenting, I think there's a real tendency to sleepwalk into decisions, just do what comes naturally because historically it's been the way of doing things, and that's why we need to be having really disruptive conversations just to force that conversation. And it's completely fine for a woman to say, I'm going to have a baby and I want to stay at home and I want to take a year's maternity leave and I want to take longer and I want to be the person at home. That is completely fine. But what I really want to see is people making informed decisions and having those conversations at home and challenging some of those social norms.
Libby, slightly off topic, but you mentioned your grandmother, Enid Lyons. If she was around now, how do you think she'd be feeling about the Liberal Party, especially given the recent months where we've seen the example of Julia Banks and Sid Marlis, and even the disappointment that Julie Bishop faced when the party avoided choosing her to take over as leader?
I think she'd be perplexed about politics as a whole in Australia today, knowing my grandmother. Look, you know, it is incumbent on every one of us to call out unacceptable behaviour in a workplace. And it doesn't matter what or where that workplace is. And until each of us starts calling out that unacceptable behaviour more, it's not going to become the norm. I think she would be disappointed about the state of gender equality in Australia at large. I think she'd be particularly disappointed about the representation of women in politics across Australia at large. You know, she was a trailblazer, but goodness me, that was 75 years ago. And we're still talking about getting more women into politics. This is a nonsense. And she would find it a nonsense. And I think she's probably turning in a grave right now.
I'd say that she'd probably be very proud of the work that you're doing.
Oh, thank you, Sabra.
Yeah. Elysia, do you have thoughts from the UK experience? I mean, you can't be if you can't see it.
Yeah.
How have you got tips for Australian politicians on how to get more women not into safe seats? A lot of them contest marginal seats here.
Yeah, well, we've celebrated our centenary this year of some women getting the right to vote, not all women. And what we'd really like by our centenary of all women getting the right to vote in 2028 is for us to have a parliament that represents the people that it serves. But we are a long way away from that at the moment. And so, no, I don't have any advice because I don't think that we've necessarily got it cracked yet. But what is really heartening to see, I think, is a number of conversations about challenging cultural issues. One of the big challenges, of course, at the moment is online abuse that women get. You know, we see time and time again that men get challenged on their policies and women get rape threats. You know, it's a real gendered issue, and I think we need to be able to call that out more. We need to challenge that, and we need to just change the societal view that that's okay. I mean, I don't think widely people openly think that that's okay, but it exists. That's the way that it exists. And I think that would act as a deterrent to a lot of women. Why would you expose yourself to that, and why would you expose your family to that if you don't have to?
Ladies, we could keep talking all day. Thank you both very much. Everyone, please join me in thanking you. Now, we have tokens of our appreciation to you both. Libby Lyons, membership again to the Press Club, plus we have a bottle of something for you. And Elysia, we have Stand and Deliver, a copy of the history of the first 50 years of the Press Club here, and also a little bottle for something for you to enjoy too while you're here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you both very much.